In this comparative study, I'll explore how mise-en-scène and cinematography are used to represent each superhero's emotional struggle to belong within their world. I'll examine two superhero films, Superman 1978, directed by Richard Donner, and The Dark Knight 2008, directed by Christopher Nolan. Superhero films often focus on characters with dual identities who must balance their public role as protectors with their private emotional needs. Both Superman and The Dark Knight follow heroes who protect their city while remaining personally isolated from them. However, while Superman presents belonging as achievable through emotional openness and moral clarity, The Dark Knight presents belonging as incompatible with heroism itself. To understand how these differences emerge, it is necessary to examine the cultural context that each film constructs within its narrative world. Although both films are set in large American cities, they depict fundamentally different cultural environments that shape values, institutions, and social expectations faced by each hero. Superman is set primarily in Metropolis, a city defined by optimism, stability, and openness. The geography of the city emphasizes wide streets, bright interiors, and accessible public spaces. These settings suggest a culture built on visibility and trust rather than fear or control. Institutions within the film function reliably and ethically. The Daily Planet represents journalism as a stabilizing force that values truth and public responsibility. Superman aligns himself with these institutions rather than acting in opposition to them, reinforcing his desire to be part of this society rather than separate from it. Economically, Metropolis appears functional and secure. Characters participate in everyday work, and Clark Kent's role as a reporter places him firmly within the working community. Socially, difference is tolerated and even embraced. Clark's awkwardness is treated with humor, suggesting a culture that allows individuality without exclusion. Together, these elements create a cultural context in which belonging is not only possible but encouraged. In contrast, The Dark Knight presents Gotham as a city defined by instability, fear, and moral fragmentation. The geography is dense and vertical, with narrow streets and enclosed interiors that restrict movement and visibility. The city feels compressed, creating constant tension. Institutions such as law enforcement and government are portrayed as fragile or compromised. Because these systems fail to maintain order, Batman is forced to operate outside them, positioning him in direct conflict with the society he protects. Economically, Gotham reflects deep divisions. Corporate skyscrapers coexist with decaying urban spaces, reinforcing separation rather than unity. Bruce Wayne's wealth isolates him socially, preventing meaningful connection with either the elite or the public. Socially, Gotham is governed by suspicion. Batman is both relied upon and rejected, making acceptance impossible. Technology, particularly surveillance, dominates the film, increasing control while reducing intimacy. Gotham's cultural context therefore makes belonging structurally unattainable. In Superman, high-key lighting and warm color palettes dominate the film's visual style. Superman is frequently shown fully illuminated and visually integrated into his environment. During the helicopter rescue scene, bright lights frame him as part of Metropolis rather than above it. Lighting here reinforces emotional openness and trust.
Easy, miss. I've got you.
By contrast, The Dark Knight relies heavily on low-key lighting and desaturated tones. In the Joker interrogation scene, harsh overhead lighting creates deep shadows across Batman's face, emphasizing moral and emotional isolation. Darkness becomes a visual barrier between Batman and society. Thus, lighting functions as a key indicator of whether belonging is actually possible. This contrast in lighting also shapes how the audience emotionally aligns with each hero. In Superman, the consistent use of high-key lighting minimizes visual threat and allows the audience to clearly read Superman's expressions, reinforcing honesty and emotional transparency. The lack of shadows suggests that Superman has nothing to hide, visually supporting his desire to exist openly within society. In The Dark Knight, however, shadow is persistent and unavoidable. Batman is frequently partially obscured, which reflects his fractured identity and moral uncertainty. The darkness surrounding him suggests that full visibility would be dangerous, reinforcing the idea that emotional openness is incompatible with survival in Gotham. Lighting therefore does not establish mood, but actively communicates whether each hero can safely belong within their world. Clark Kent's costume is intentionally unremarkable, allowing him to blend into Metropolis. The Daily Planet is crowded and communal, reinforcing social interrogation. Superman's environments are designed for interaction rather than isolation. Batman's armored batsuit, however, is rigid and mechanical, symbolizing emotional distance. The Batcave is vast, empty, and metallic, emphasizing solitude. Gotham's spaces compress Bruce Wayne physically and emotionally, reinforcing separation. Both films use space to express the cost of heroism, but only Superman allows its hero to exist comfortably within society. The contrast in spatial design also reflects how each hero navigates identity. Clark Kent's ordinary clothing and shared workspaces allow him to move between his public and private identities with relative ease. The Daily Planet's open layout and constant activity reinforce the idea that Clark belongs within a social system that values participation and collaboration. In contrast, Batman's costume functions as armor rather than clothing, visually separating him from other characters even when he occupies the same space. The Batcave's emptiness emphasizes not only isolation, but permanence, suggesting that solitude is not temporary, but required. Gotham's tight and oppressive spaces further reinforce this idea, as Bruce Wayne is rarely shown in environments that encourage comfort or connection. Space, therefore, becomes a visual measure of how much emotional distance each hero must maintain. This spatial contrast also affects how the audience interprets each hero's emotional state over time. In Superman, repeated exposure to shared spaces like the Daily Planet normalizes Clark's presence within society, making him struggle feel internal rather than imposed by the environment. Because these spaces remain consistent and welcoming, the audience understands that Clark's identity conflict is manageable and does not require isolation. In The Dark Knight, however, Batman's repeated return to isolated spaces such as the Batcave reinforce the idea that separation is unavoidable. Gotham rarely offers neutral or communal spaces where Bruce Wayne can exist without tension, which visually communicates that his emotional distance is permanent rather than situational. As a result, space becomes a narrative constant that reinforces Superman's potential for integration and Batman's acceptance of isolation as the cost of heroism. Superman frequently uses medium shots and gentle close-ups that emphasize sincerity and accessibility. Crane shots during flight sequences create a shared perspective, inviting the audience to experience the world alongside Superman. In The Dark Knight, tight close-ups and shallow focus isolate Bruce Wayne from his surroundings. Handheld camera movement introduces instability, visual mirroring his internal conflict. The camera itself becomes a source of tension rather than connection. Framing therefore determines whether the audience is invited to the superhero's emotional world or kept at a distance. Framing also determines how emotionally safe the audience feels engaging with each superhero. In Superman, medium shots provide enough proximity to establish intimacy while situating Superman within his environment, reinforcing his connection to others. The use of smooth camera movement during flight creates a sense of freedom and shared experience, allowing the audience to feel included rather than excluded. In The Dark Knight, however, tight framing restricts space around Bruce Wayne, often cutting off parts of his face or body. The visual confinement mirrors his emotional entrapment and reinforces the idea that he cannot fully express himself. Handheld movement further destabilizes the image, preventing visual comfort. As a result, the camera does not simply observe Batman's isolation, it actively places the audience inside that tension. Through mise-en-scène and cinematography, Superman and The Dark Knight construct opposing visions of heroism and belonging. Superman presents a cultural environment defined by openness, stability, and moral clarity, allowing belonging to remain achievable. Superman's struggle lies in balancing his power with emotional restraint, not in gaining acceptance. In contrast, The Dark Knight constructs a world shaped by fear, fragmentation, and institutional failure. Gotham's visual culture denies belonging entirely, forcing Batman to sacrifice personal connection in order to protect society. Together, these films demonstrate that belonging is not determined by the hero alone, but by the cultural world that the film constructs around them. Cinematic design ultimately defines whether heroism is a path toward integration or permanent isolation. This comparison ultimately shows how superhero films use visual language to make abstract ideas about identity and belonging concrete. Through choices in lighting, framing, and setting, both films transform internal emotional conflict into visual, spatial, and visual patterns that the audience can immediately understand. Superman uses visual clarity, openness, and shared space to suggest that heroism can coexist with human connection, while The Dark Knight uses darkness, restriction, and isolation to suggest that heroism demands personal loss. In this way, mise-en-scène and cinematography do not simply support the narrative, but actively shape the moral and emotional meaning of each hero's journey, reinforcing how the environment determines whether belonging is achievable or denied.